Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. I'm Dan Hope. He's Andy Anders. Ohio State football now almost 1 week into the start of preseason camp. The Buckeyes opened practice last Thursday, opened up their first 4 practices to both paying fans as well as members of the media. And so we have had the opportunity to see quite a bit of practice already for the Buckeyes. We're also back at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center on Tuesday following Ohio State's 5th practice of camp to talk to Chip Kelly and Ohio State's quarterbacks. And so I think we both sit here, Andy, probably feeling like we have a significantly better feel for this team and where it's at than we did just a week ago.
Absolutely. And getting to watch the first 4 practices of a fall camp is a rare treat, I think, that was opened up by, Ohio State opening those practices up to the fans. And so we as reporters, got a little more insight, I think, than we normally would at this point. And I think maybe the most revealing thing for me was Sunday's practice and watching Will Howard take basically all but one of the first team quarterback reps when the team went 11-on-11. 7-on-7, even a little in there. And so the one rep he didn't get, Julian saying threw a pick 6 to Jermaine Mathews. So there was I think there's a little bit now of an eminence happening at that quarterback spot that Will Howard is starting to take control of that, even if Chip Kelly tried to push back some a little bit on it when we talked to him on Tuesday, saying that, hey, don't read too much into the fact that he was like the first teamer the whole time. He took third team reps today. Like, I just don't buy it. I think it's clear that Will Howard, despite some criticisms that I've had in the past, he looked better throwing the ball even in those practices, just to my untrained eye, like more zip, as Day and Kelly said, more accuracy on the throws. And his command, his consistency, all those things, I think he's clearly emerging as the front runner to start at quarterback for Ohio State, as a lot of us expected him to this offseason.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he's more comfortable now than he was in the spring. I mean, he acknowledged that on Tuesday that, he had some struggles. He felt like he was drinking through a fire hose at first when the Buckeyes had their first practices of the spring. And he's progressively gotten more and more comfortable as he's had more time to learn the offense, as he's built more chemistry with Ohio State's receivers. And I think you see now his experience making a difference in this competition, where he looks like he has the best command of the offense. He looks like he's the one who's most efficient passing the ball, who's most consistently going through his progressions and making the right reads and finding the open receivers and showing that athleticism as well. I mean, we saw on Saturday when Will Howard, ran for, what maybe could have been an 80-yard touchdown if it wasn't whistled dead. We heard Chip Kelly say on Tuesday that Will Howard has been clocked running at 22 miles per hour. And so this is a guy who offers them that dual threat they've been looking for at quarterback. Now, I think we still want to keep everything in perspective. Like, Will Howard is not CJ Stroud. He's not Justin Fields. He's not Dwayne Haskins. Like, he's not any of those guys. In my opinion, he does not have the same kind of pure passing ability that CJ Stroud and Dwayne Haskins did. And while he is a good athlete, a good runner, he's not Justin Fields in terms of his overall physical skill set. And so I don't think that Will Howard is going to be the next, first round draft pick quarterback out of Ohio State, barring a, massive jump here in his 5th year senior season. But I'm feeling a lot more confident now than I did a week ago that he can be good enough that when you put him in an offense with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, with Emeka Egbuka and Carnell Tate and Jeremiah Smith and Brandon Inniss, that he can be good enough for this team to achieve its goals.
Right, and that's the point he made on Tuesday, as you guys can listen into.
I think that, the one thing I would say is that I don't feel like I have to be a hero here. And I feel like I have the guys around me to where I just need to facilitate and just get them the ball and make good decisions. And at the end of the day, I don't have to go out there and do anything superhuman, I just have to be myself and trust the guys around me. And
for me, that hit the nail on the head. I tweeted that quote out after he said it. I wrote a story about it. You like you said, you have all these weapons around you. Freshman phenom, probably the best freshman in the country out wide. But then you have a guy who's had an 1,100-yard season already in college, who's probably going to be your number one target in Emeka Egbuka. And you've got Brandon Inniss and Carnell Tate coming into year 2, and they've looked really good. So that is all really, I think, the mentality Will needs to have. Game manager is sometimes used as an insult for quarterbacks. I don't see it as an insult at all here if you say Will Howard just needs to be a game manager this year, because that's what he said, and it's what I think you just need when you have a defense this talented, when you have these many weapons around you. That's all you need to do is manage the game. Don't turn the ball over. Get those guys the ball in space and let them go make plays. And then he'll have the ability to make plays himself, as you referenced, with the running speed. And there's a lot of stress that puts on the defense.
Yeah, and Chip Kelly talked more about Will Howard's running ability on Tuesday as well, and we'll play that clip for you.
When I talked to Jimmy Knowles, we spent a lot of time with our defensive staff. They do a great job of what hurts you, and really what don't you want to see, but when you have somebody that can be a dual threat, that's a really tough thing to defend sometimes, because, all right, we're going to play 2-man and lock up these receivers and double their 2 best receivers and go. Well, if they've all turned their back to the quarterback and the 4-man rush doesn't get home and the quarterback now takes off, there's nobody left, and it's not, I think, obviously we know how fast Will is, so it's not like if he runs, it's a 6-yard gain. Like if he takes off, it could be a 60-yard gain.
Yeah, we know just from Chip Kelly's history that the quarterback run game is probably going to be a much bigger part of this offense this year than it's been the last few years. Both Ryan Day and Chip Kelly have said repeatedly it needs to be a part of our offense this year. That's a big reason why they brought in Will in the beginning. And I think they truly believe that any of their 5 quarterbacks could bring that element to the table. But it does feel to me like, Will Howard is doing the things he needs to do to put himself in strong position to be that starting quarterback and potentially end this starting quarterback competition sooner than later. Because like you, I do not buy the coach speak from Chip Kelly that, we shouldn't read into the reps at all. I mean, again, you can only put so much stock in one practice, but I think fairly consistently, not the first day of practice. I'd say the first day of practice, Will still struggled, but practices 2 through 4, he was the best quarterback out there. He was the guy getting most of the reps. And like you said, it's been the expectation all along that it was going to be his job to lose. So we're not exactly saying anything groundbreaking here by saying that Will Howard has emerged as the front runner in the starting quarterback competition. That was always the expectation. I think we both agreed in the spring that Devin Brown looked better than Will Howard, but I think in the first 4 days of preseason camp, that was not the case. I think Devin still has that best deep ball throwing ability on the team. I still have questions about Will in that area. I think, practice 2, I'd say on Friday, we saw him throw a couple really nice deep balls. Didn't do a whole lot of that the next couple days, so I'm still not quite sure what Will can be as a deep passer. I think that's still a question mark. But I think in the short to intermediate game, he was much more efficient than the other quarterbacks over the totality of those 4 practices. And to your point, Andy, obviously the quarterback has to be able to go up there and make plays to win games. But when you have a group this talented, it's also important you have a quarterback who's not going to lose you games, who's not going to make costly mistakes that can swing the game the other direction. And I think that's an area where Will's going to have the advantage in the sense that, he has that experience and he's probably going to be the guy they trust the most to go out there and not turn the ball over.
Right. And I think the first series against Michigan last year comes to mind for a lot of Ohio State fans when you make that point. Not making mistakes is a part of this. And not to say that Will's going to be the perfect quarterback, not to say that there won't be turnovers, but less of them is always better. And I think, too, something you can see his experience play out in some of the strengths that he has. And I think in particular, his pocket presence has been pretty impressive, watching how he can manipulate and kind of just subtle slides, subtle steps to avoid the rush and get a throw off. Those are little things you learn with reps and with experience at the quarterback position. Now, in the spring, I think one thing I didn't give enough credence to was the adjustment period, because Chip Kelly kind of said it on Tuesday in a couple different spots of both in terms of Will's arm strength and his accuracy. Those are two things impacted by a quarterback not having enough knowledge of the scheme that he's in, not understanding exactly what the reads are on a play, or at least maybe you understand it, but you're not confident in it, those sorts of things. And I think it was a good point that Chip made, is because even when I asked a question like, Will has looked a lot better accuracy-wise these last few practices that we've seen, I asked how much of that is timing and chemistry with receivers, and then how much of that is like a mechanical thing maybe that he worked on. And Chip basically said neither, didn't use that word, but it kind of was the implication, because what he said was exactly that. Knowledge, I think, is the other thing that you have to factor in. And now that he is no longer drinking from a fire hose, now that he has learned of the offense, I think we're seeing more confidence, and confidence is so key to this kind of a thing. So that is progression, I think, that Ohio State fans should be excited about for Will Howard. Still a long way to go, still improvements to make, and definitely the deep ball is still a concern that I have too. But I think he's definitely taken noticeable strides this first week, and if nothing else, he again emerged as the front runner for that job.
Another player who I think has emerged as a front runner to start over the first week of camp is Sonny Styles. And, this was one I think we were kind of less sure on going into preseason camp of who was the front runner between Sonny Styles and CJ Hicks. But for all 4 practices that we were out there, Sonny took the majority of the reps along with the 10 other guys who are going to be starters on Ohio State's defense. And so it certainly feels like he's the front runner. Now, that's not exactly what Jim Knowles said when he was asked about it on Friday. He said that those guys are neck and neck, but I personally was really impressed by Sonny Styles watching him those first 4 practices, maybe as much as any player out there, because he looks very natural at that linebacker role. I think what struck out to me was seeing how good he looked coming downhill and playing the run, because, you expect you move a guy who's been a safety to linebacker, you expect coverage is going to be a strength, but he did not look out of place, coming downhill, making run fits, making tackles around the line of scrimmage. And I think if he's got that, paired with his athleticism, the coverage ability we know he has, I think he has all the tools to be an elite will linebacker in Ohio State's defense.
Yeah, Sonny, again, like you said, the run fits, to me, I think it does make a little sense in my head, because to me, Sonny's best plays came in the box last year. And that's why both of us agreed that the move to linebacker made a lot of sense, because he struggled in kind of those open field spaces. Quarterback scrambles, and you've got to take him down in open space. We saw some struggles in that against Missouri, covering some of the deep shots down the field, covering slot receivers when he played the nickel. Like, these are the things he struggled with, I think, were more toward that open field, deep safety side of things. And he made a lot of his best plays in the box, and had a really good tackle number for the amount of snaps he played, made a couple sacks, these kinds of things. And so, to me, that's why the move to linebacker made sense. But to your point, to see him acclimate to it so quickly and learn the position and how the run fits work at will linebacker, how you factor into the scheme, what your role is, that was the thing that you think, okay, Sonny could be great at this, but it might take some time to adjust. And just how quickly he's picked it up is the most startling thing to me in all of this, because it's not easy. But I think it shows the talent that Sonny has, and clearly the football knowledge to pick up on the scheme that quickly.
Now, the question then becomes with that, if Sonny Styles is the starting will linebacker, will we see CJ Hicks play a role in this defense this year? Because Ohio State fans have been waiting, going on 3 years now to see CJ Hicks play a significant role in this defense. And I think, to some degree, that's just kind of to be seen, because we haven't seen a ton of rotation at linebacker in Jim Knowles' first years on the staff. But he said last week that he does plan to use more free linebacker packages this year to get both CJ and Sonny on the field.
In the 4-2 scheme, I think they're they're both neck and neck right now. We got to continue to look at and create more ways to get all three of them on the field. Take the nickel out. So I think our depth at nickel concerns me. Hopefully, Lorenzo has been hurt. He's coming back, but hopefully he'll fill that. Right now at that, behind Jordan, everybody's kind of taking shots. Jermaine's taking some shots. Denzel's taking some shots. Everybody's learning the position. But, Sonny, if you remember, the plan initially last year was playing that nickel Sam, until Lathan got hurt and we had to move him back. So I feel like we can get all three of them in the game a significant amount.
There were some interesting concepts with CJ Hicks that I think I saw during practices that we got to watch. And I think the 4-3 is definitely, I think, a defense that Ohio State's going to deploy more of this year, in particular because Sonny has that experience at safety, where I said, pass coverage was something of a weakness down the field covering a slot receiver last year. I think if you take that same skill set and he's guarding a tight end or a running back, it's a huge strength. Like, you pair that body with that much speed, and Sonny's so big and physical against a tight end, I think he could lock most tight ends in college football up man to man. I think then you have CJ, who's got this speed rusher skill set off the edge. You could play him at the end of the line of scrimmage and do some pretty unique things with that. And against some of the heavier fronts you're going to see in the Big Ten, the 4-3 obviously is something to deploy. And we've seen it in the past with Jim Knowles. And I think that's how you get all of them on the field, especially is when you're playing those heavier packages, 12 personnel, things of that nature. That's when you have the ability. And not to take Jordan Hancock off the field too much, because Jordan Hancock's a really good player and a fantastic nickel, I think, as he showed through, the last 3 quarters really of last season. But it's definitely a chess piece that you have when you've got 2 5-star prospects battling to start at that will linebacker spot.
Now, I think probably the biggest position battle that's still lingering a week into camp is at that right guard position. We know how important it's going to be for Ohio State's offensive line to improve this year. And still, one big question to be answered there in terms of who's going to be that starting right guard in between Seth McLaughlin and Josh Fryar, who, they both certainly seem to be solidified starters now. I mean, we haven't seen anybody other than Josh Fryar take a first-team rep at right tackle. We did see Seth, move over, at one point to play a little bit of guard during Sunday's practice, but for the most part, he's been in there at that first-team center. Carson Hinsman's gotten a few reps in there with the first-team offensive line as well. And even Luke Montgomery is mixed in at center for some reps. But it does feel like Seth McLaughlin's, very close to, locking up that starting center job. But the question now is really at that right guard spot between Carson Hinsman and Tegra Tshabola. And I think when we talked last week, we felt like, okay, maybe Carson's trending toward being that front runner at that right guard spot. But we've said all along, we felt like Tegra Tshabola had a lot of upside there. And I think we've seen that in these first 4 days of practice, that, he's, looked like his body's better than it's ever been before. He's explosive. He's powerful. I think, there's a definite possibility that Tegra Tshabola can win this starting job based on what we've seen so far. I don't think this one, is settled yet in any way. And maybe this one plays out a little bit longer because, Ryan Day, when he was talking about Tegra Tshabola on the first day of camp was, had a lot of very positive things to say about Tegra, talking up his potential, the ability that he has, but saying that, they want to see it consistently in preseason camp. So maybe it takes a little bit longer to play out because they really want to see between Tegra and Carson who can be the most consistent guy at that spot. I think they're both still in the mix, but I do feel like Tegra Tshabola, with, what we've seen from him so far in camp, is certainly making a push for that starting job.
Yeah, and to me, I think in general, it's hard to judge offensive linemen and really mark down those things before you hit full contact, as Ohio State started to do at the end of the practices that we watched, but probably not full 100% yet. The lineup, obviously, that you mentioned that we saw with Luke at center and Seth at right guard, and then Austin Sarabel at left guard, because Donovan Jackson was kind of mixing in some rest on Sunday. One of those guys with a lot of reps on his body in his college career. And I think the staff is taking certain precautions with those kinds of players. As we've seen some of that mix in, I think there's some signs, and definitely, especially in the pass rush one-on-ones, you can point to, but it's going to be a matter of, getting the pads on and seeing how those guys hit and seeing how all of that goes fully before you can make a determination on right guard. I've said it in the past, though, this is something you want to settle as quickly as possible, because offensive line chemistry, it's the most important position in football to establish chemistry to establish 5 guys who are just in lockstep with each other and know when to pass off a block, know, the timing, when to climb to the second level on a running play, know exactly what their roles are in blitz pickup on a pass play. Like, it's such an important position to develop that, again, chemistry at. So figure it out quickly. And yeah, Tegra Tshabola has really stood out to me, though, in his physique, as you mentioned, and the offensive line as a whole, I think, has looked pretty slimmed down. Josh Fryar, another one that looks different physically than he did, I think, in the spring, or especially dating back to last year. And so the offensive line, and this is something Chip Kelly pointed out, clearly put in a lot of the work in the summer to try and change their bodies. I think there's a concerted effort there to improve on some of the lapses we saw last year, especially in that Cotton Bowl, especially in certain other games, and try to take what was the team's main weakness last year and turn it into a place where, again, with the talent around it, it's a national title caliber. So that's, I think, going to be one of the main storylines to watch, as we've referenced, going into the season, and settling that right guard competition quickly, whether it's Tegra, whether it's Carson Hinsman, who kind of seemed like the front runner coming out of Big Ten Media Days, but now it seems like Tegra's gotten most of the reps. Obviously, Carson was out the first practice. Seeing how that unfolds is, I think, the main thing I have my eyes locked on now as fall camp progresses, since quarterback seems kind of on the road to being settled.
Yeah, it was nice getting to watch some of those initial padded practices and seeing, the offensive linemen, defensive linemen going head to head in one-on-ones. I thought Josh Simmons looked really good in what we saw from those practices. Saw him several times win reps against Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau, who are 2 tough guys to block. So if you're doing that, you're doing something right. I thought Seth McLaughlin looked really good in those one-on-ones. Just really does a great job of just anchoring well and getting his hands on guys and keeping them out of the pocket. And so I think, he's been impressive. You can see why they brought him in. Again, Josh Fryar is a guy who I think has had a pretty good start to camp. Maybe not as, quite at the level of Simmons, but I think you can see the progression from him and certainly him looking better physically than he did last year. So I'm kind of in the same boat with the offensive line where I was at quarterback, where I come out of this first week feeling better about the offensive line than I did a week ago. I still don't feel, great, nothing to worry about, all questions answered, guaranteed national title. Like, there's, it's still going to be a question mark until they actually get out there on the field and play games. Frankly, it's going to be a question mark until, the 5th or 6th game of a season, because, those first 3 or 4 games are not going to test this offensive line very much. So I think really until they play Iowa and Oregon in October, we're really not going to know a whole lot about this offensive line. But based on what we've seen in preseason camp, I mean, we talked about it last week, the big thing you wanted to see from Will Howard, from this offensive line, from this offense as a whole, was that they could be competitive with Ohio State's defense. I think we'd both agree that, over the course of those 4 practices, Ohio State's defense still won more than it didn't. I think the defense was still the better unit of the 2, but it should be, because it's a defense that was a top 3 unit last year and on paper has only gotten better since last year. And so, this should be the best defense in the country. It should be the strength of the team. It should be hard for Ohio State's offense to move the ball against that defense in practice. But I think we've seen both the offensive line and will Howard do well enough against that defense while using the great weapons they have around them to feel like this offense is making strides? That will the quarterback and offensive line play be to the point where this can be a truly, elite top offense in the country kind of unit? I don't know. But can it be good enough paired with that defense for this to potentially be a national championship team? I think there's a lot of reason for optimism there.
I'd agree. And I think, outside of offensive line, the only other position battle that's really still ongoing, still feels up in the air, is punter. And to that end, Nick McLarty has, I think he's shown both the absolute upside of his massive leg, being 6'7", 255, and having that Aussie rules football background that so many great punters have come from. And he's also shown the downside, because you see him boot a ball literally 80 yards into the corner of the field one snap, and then another, because he has such a powerful leg, his miss hits are also very big, and he shanks one. And so really, that battle seems to kind of be developing between him and Anthony Venneri, the walk-on Buffalo transfer Ohio State brought in this year. And I think Venneri's looked more consistent. Like, it feels like every punt you're going to get a 40-something yarder out of Venneri. But McLarty at his best he's just got that massive leg, and he can boot it so far down the field. But again, it's that consistency. And that if McLarty develops that consistency, I think it's a settled thing, and this is who you go with. But Venneri being the more reliable guy, McLarty being a freshman, we'll see if it gets there. And Nick will have ideally a few more years at Ohio State to be the guy if Venneri ends up taking it from him this year. But it's just interesting to see, because you didn't really think about it before with a punter. Like, why would having a big leg be a downside? Well, because if it's just a centimeter off your foot and you're booting it, with more power than the other guy, he can mishit it the same amount, but it's not going to be as exaggerated a shank as the guy with the more powerful leg. So developing that consistency is what's key for Nick McLarty. And if he does, I think he ends up being Ohio State's punter this fall.
Yeah, ultimately, reliability and consistency is the most important thing for a punter. Like, having, a 70-yard field flipping punt is great, but if you don't know what you're going to get every time that punter is going to go out there, that's going to be a problem. So I think, right now, at least it was me, like, based on what we've seen, if you were picking a punter to go punt in a game today for Ohio State, it would be Anthony Venneri, because he's proven he can do it for 2 years in college. He's been, if nothing else, steady in practice, looking solid each day. And so I think right now, like, he would be the guy just based on the consistency he's shown. If Nick McLarty can get there over the next 3 weeks, then you certainly have reason to consider going with him because of how strong his leg is, because of the fact he's your only scholarship punter. But he has to prove that he can be a guy you can consistently rely on before you're going to put him out there. Though I do wonder too, like, you don't see this a ton, but like, could there be a scenario where, Anthony Venneri is your top punter, but you throw Nick McLarty out there once in a while as kind of a situational punter, like you're backed up and you really need to flip the field. Do you throw him out there just to uncork one once in a while? You don't see that a ton at punter, but I could see, with his unique skill set, there potentially being a scenario where Anthony Venneri would be your regular punter, but you bring Nick McLarty on every once in a while because of what a big leg he has.
Platooning quarterbacks you've heard of, but platooning punters, folks. That seems like honestly a suggestion that makes sense, but I'm not, obviously we don't really know where Ohio State's coaching staff stands in some of that regard. And you pointed it out, Dan, and it really, I think until you said something, hadn't kind of struck me that one position battle we hadn't considered previously that might be becoming a thing in fall camp very subtly is tight end, because I think Jelani, Thurman, and Will Kacmarek have had some great days that we've watched and have worked in plenty with a lot of different groups with the offense. could they make this a position battle with G. Scott Jr.? G. Scott's been in the program so long and done, obviously emerged as a real leader in the locker room, especially this offseason, but in the past too. Could Will Kacmarek and Jelani Thurman challenge him is kind of a question that you start popping into your mind when you consider what the last few practices, what we've seen in the last few practices. And, I go back and I think, I've seen Will Kacmarek and Jelani Thurman have plenty of big catches. I've seen G get some targets, make a catch or two, but to me, if I knew nothing about the three of them and you told me, hey, go out there and who's the starting tight end from these practices, I would probably point to Will or Jelani right now. So it's been interesting to see maybe there's a subtle battle going on there, or maybe like you said with the punters, maybe one of those guys could make an argument to be used situationally.
Well, I think multiple guys are going to be used at that position no matter what. I mean, we know that, Ohio State likes using its share of 2 tight end sets. I don't think that's going to change with Chip Kelly. And so I think, there's going to be roles regardless for at least 2 of those guys, probably 3 of those guys to some degree. And, tight end's a position, we've kind of seen it both tight end and wide receiver, but you can't really get a clear pecking order based on practice because they've just kind of rolled those guys between units. I mean, I think we've seen Bennett Christian in there after first team. We've seen Patrick Gerd in there after first team. So they're getting lots of guys reps there at tight end. There really hasn't been any clear pecking order based on what we've seen in practice. But, to the larger point, I don't know that G. Scott ever necessarily had the starting tight end job locked up. Like, I think that, the way that Ryan Day talked about him in the spring suggested that he was the leader in the clubhouse to be that guy. But I think the door is still open for Will Kacmarek and Jelani Thurman to push for that job. And I do think, Will's another guy, again, we talked about of Will Howard, another guy, I think as a transfer coming in where you're seeing more out of him now in preseason camp than maybe we did in the spring, now that he's gotten more acclimated to the offense. And he might be the best blocker of that group, which is a really important thing for a tight end in Ohio State's offense. And so I think that, there's certainly a path for Will to end up becoming the starter at tight end, or at least play a major role at tight end this year. And then Jelani Thurman's a guy, I mean, I think we both agree that he has the highest upside of that group of tight ends with just what he can be as a playmaker in the passing game. And we've seen him flash that. I think, again, you talk about it, until they're really going full pads, full contact, how well can you really evaluate like a tight end as a blocker? I think that's kind of hard, but I think we've seen the flashes from him as a receiving weapon to where he's certainly a guy you got to think about at least carving a role out for this year.
I'd agree. And, to me, Jelani has, like you said, the highest ceiling of the room, and how quickly can he reach that ceiling at such a developmental position? If he becomes the receiving threat that we feel he can be, then he might have to get more reps than was expected this year and kind of emerge from those 2 veterans. Of course, he's got time because they have Will Kacmarek and G. Scott Jr. if he doesn't get it all figured out this year. But you'd like to see him evolve into a weapon in the offense, or any one of these tight ends really get involved with the receivers who, as we kind of move on from the position battles here, I think have been among the biggest standouts. Jeremiah Smith, I mean, what more can we say about the guy? I'm on record, I think on this podcast multiple times already, saying I think he gets 1,000 yards this year. And I have never been more sure of that opinion than I am right now. I think he's going to be the number 2 receiver behind Emeka Egbuka, and he certainly looked like it. We haven't really seen much of Emeka these first handful of practices in general, but, Emeka is going to be the number 1 receiver for this team. Jeremiah Smith, though, I mean, every practice he does something eye-catching to the point it's just not even like that big of a deal anymore. It's like you see him make some go up and moss some guy on a 40-yard deep ball, and it's like, yeah, that's Jeremiah. It's kind of like how Marvin was the last 2 years he was here, where you just say, yeah, that's Marvin, and then it's kind of like that thing again. And even I think what is underrated about him too is he's great catching the ball in space on a screen and making people miss and go on a run. We've seen him do that a couple times in practice, but Brandon Inniss has looked awesome to me too. Carnell Tate has made a couple really nice catches. Like the entire receiving core outside of Emeka, who again has really not gotten that all the reps. He's kind of, again, one of those veteran guys that they're kind of managing, and but you still expect him to be the number one weapon in the receiving game for this offense. Those younger guys who are in year 1 or 2 have really stepped up and done what we expected and emerged as it's going to be that 4-man rotation at the top of Ohio State's receiver unit this year.
It's crazy to say if you lose Marvin Harrison Jr., and yet it feels like this receiving core is just going to be as good as ever, because I think all 3 of those guys have the potential to be breakout stars. And then you pair them with Emeka Egbuka, who should be one of the best receivers in the country. And you just feel like you have no worries about this receiving core, even though you really only have one guy in there that's played a lot, because Jeremiah, Carnell, Brandon, they've all looked great. There's still a little bit of a depth question behind those guys, but I think Jaden Ballard has had a good start to camp as well. I like what we've seen from him. Bryson Rogers has looked pretty good out there. Haven't seen a ton from Mylan Graham yet, but this is a guy who's just gone through his first 5 practices as a Buckeye. So you don't necessarily expect a lot from Mylan, even though he's a 5-star recruit as a freshman. But, I think that top 4 is really, really, really good. I think it's going to be hard for anybody else to really break into that rotation consistently, but it does feel like they have a couple decent depth options there in Jaden Ballard and Bryson Rogers to round out that 2 deep behind a quartet that I do think certainly has the potential to be the best in the country this season. Kind of a similar equation at running back where, we expect the top 2, Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, to be the best running back tandem in the country. The depth behind them is more suspect, but I really like what we've seen from both Sam Williams-Dixon and James Peoples so far in preseason camp. I thought they had good springs, and I think they've looked even better so far in camp. And so I feel pretty good about, those guys' ability to play this year. Now, you're still in that spot where it's like you really don't want to see either Trey or Quinshon go down, because if that happens, you're going to have to lean heavily on at least one of those freshmen. And that's never the most comforting thing. But based on what we've seen from them, I think both those guys have the potential to be dynamic running backs for Ohio State. I think Peoples has looked, really good, just in that running game, finding holes in between the tackles, showing some, cutting ability that's really good for his size. I really like, his upside, whether they need him this year or whether we're just talking long-term for the future. I really like what we've seen from him as a running back. And then, Sam Williams-Dixon's a guy that just really catches my eye a lot out there. I think he looks really good in that receiver out of a backfield kind of a role, which was what was expected when they were recruiting him. But I think that's a guy. I think a lot of people probably kind of have him tabbed as a redshirt kind of guy because he's a 3-star recruit coming in, but I'm not so sure that's going to be the case. 1, because they just don't have that much depth at running back, but 2, I think he's a guy that, can be a weapon for them. Maybe not so much this year as long as Travion and Quinshon stay healthy, but I think his ability, he might already be the best receiver out of a backfield in that room. And so I'm eager to see what he can become over the course of his career in that role, because I really like what we've seen from him in that capacity so far in camp.
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I think running the ball, he's been a pleasant surprise for me. He has good vision and he's really shifty, and I think that it's always a great combo to have at running back. He's going to have to put on some weight to be, a ball carrier in the future, but that's down the road. You hopefully don't have to call on him this season, but I do think, from what we've seen in practice, it feels like Ohio State found a gem here. A guy who maybe should have been looked at more highly by the recruiting services. And Sam Williams-Dixon to me has been one of the biggest surprises this preseason camp. Not a surprise, the secondary looks awesome. I think that we both expected Denzel Burke, Davison Igbinosun, Jordan Hancock, Lathan Ransom, and then Caleb Downs coming in to build upon what was the number 1 pass defense in college football already last year. And you add the number 1 transfer in college football at 100 tackles and 2 interceptions in the SEC as a freshman with Caleb Downs to that. It's We expected it to be awesome. They've looked awesome in camp, but I think what stood out is the depth pieces. We've talked about that at other positions, but Jermaine Mathews Jr. is really, really good, man. He'd start for 95% of college football teams, I think. And
Might be higher.
Might be higher. Might be 99%.
Yeah.
Might be all but one, frankly. And we've talked about how good Jeremiah Smith is. I think he's the only guy I've seen get a PBU against Jeremiah Smith. He was covering him out of the nickel, which is a good development. Ohio State, you heard Jim Knowles speak about some concerns at nickel, and I was surprised when he said that because, Lorenzo Styles has been limited. He's coming back, and you have Jermaine there, who I thought looked really good when he played nickel those first few practices. He had the pick 6 against Julian Sanigan out of the nickel, and so he has looked phenomenal these first handful of practices. And then Calvin Simpson-Hunt had an amazing Friday, multiple pass breakups, and had an interception on Sunday too. So the depth at corner is insane. I think not only is it the best top-end cornerback room in the country, it's probably the deepest cornerback room in the country too when you consider Jermaine Mathews Jr. and what we've seen from Calvin Simpson-Hunt at that position. So you can't beam enough about this secondary, and they've shown why they're so vaunted in these first handful of fall practices.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely loaded at cornerback. We've talked about that a lot all off season. I think, safety too. We've seen some of the depth show up there, particularly Jaylen McLean. I mean, that's a guy who had, really good spring game. We've seen him make a lot of plays over those first 4 practices. So, is he a guy that forces his way onto that safety 2 deep? We've seen, Malik Hartford take his share of first team reps at safety as they've, kind of limited Caleb Downs to, keep him healthy in some of those team drill sessions. And so I think safety depth is still a question mark for this team. But, with a guy like Jaylen McLean, really popping a lot in practice, I think that makes you feel better about, what you have there at that position behind, the excellent duo of Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom. Another position where I don't think we have any questions about the depth is on the defensive line. And I think that's another thing that's really stood out so far in practice. We know Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, Ty Hamilton, that's an elite quartet, and all 4 of them have looked good out there. But, seeing a guy like Mitchell Melton, who we both agreed had a really good spring, I think he's off to another really good start in preseason camp. You just see his skill as a pass rusher, his, quickness and ability to use his hands to, beat blockers off the line of scrimmage. He's a guy who continues to make the case that even with Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Kenyatta Jackson Jr., and Caden Curry, that he should have a role in that defensive end rotation this year. And, that's not to say that, the other guys don't, because, I think Kenyatta Jackson Jr. is another guy that I think, for you in particular, Andy, really caught your eye. And I think, on the inside as well, I think, Caden McDonald, Jim Knowles described him on Friday as a guy you got to keep your eye on. And he has certainly flashed to me in the first week of camp. Jason Moore, another guy who, we heard Larry Johnson call him the ideal free technique in the spring. And I think, he's showing some of that ability in camp. And so I think, that secondary and the defensive line, it's kind of like they're kind of competing for what's the deepest unit on this team, because I think Ohio State is loaded with talent at both of those position groups.
Yeah, Kenyatta, you talked about, him catching my eye. He had a really nice spin move when pass rush one-on-ones to win 1 rep, and then just a straight speed rush against, I believe it was Zid Mahalski, to win another, just right around the edge. Really hardly got a hand on him there. And so Kenyatta, just like that cornerback position, you have such luxuries in terms of your depth and who guys coming off the bench who can, relieve. And I think we are going to see Ohio State play more depth this year, both because of the talent that's there and because, again, they want to save those bodies for a 16-game playoff run. And it's starting to feel like they have depth at all 3 levels of the defense, because the backup linebackers, another position that I think stood out to both of us during these practices. Arvell Reese looks great playing, especially in coverage. I think he made some nice plays there, but also fitting in the run, and he's developing at linebacker. Gabe Powers had his nose around the football a lot these first few practices, whether that, especially on the ground and getting in the backfield even on some plays, just kind of around the football and making things happen. And we've heard a lot about Jim Knowles saying that he's one of the less heralded guys who made a lot of strides last year behind the scenes. And he's probably not going to have a significant role in the defense this year unless they really want to roll that Mike spot, because he is the second Mike, I think, behind Cody Simon, pretty assuredly now. He's not going to have maybe a huge role this year, but even for next year, you just like seeing that signs of growth from both him and Arvell at that linebacker spot.
I think Gabe Powers is the second Mike, but then you see some of the things Arvell Reese does, and it's like, man, it's hard to keep this guy off the 2 deep. Like, can you find a role for this guy? He's a guy that I think, in particular, like you said, in the passing game, whether it's dropping back into coverage or, blitzing as a pass rusher, I think he has a lot of upside. Maybe more realistically, maybe he's a year away from playing a major role in the defense, but, I really like the upside I see from him. And like you said, I think Gabe Powers has looked good in practice as well. So, yeah, I mean, I think, the defense has been what we've thought it would be so far in camp, which is to say that it's really good. The offense is, of course, where we have more question marks about this team going into the 2024 season. But I think all in all, with what we've seen so far from Will Howard, with what we've seen so far from the offensive line, there's a lot of reason to feel optimistic about where this team is at. And, quite honestly, if Ohio State didn't feel really good about where it was at right now, I don't think they're letting media in to watch 4 full practices. Like, I think even just the fact that they're opening up, more practices than they almost ever do in preseason camp, even that signals to me that there's a lot of confidence in what this team is. They don't feel like they have to hide themselves where maybe they did in past years, because there's not that glaring weakness right now that they don't want anyone to know about. I think they feel really good about what they have as a whole on this team, and I think you're starting to see it come together. Now, granted, August is the month of good feelings in college football, right? Like, everybody thinks they're going to be great until you actually play a game. And then, Ohio State will only beat Akron by 45 instead of 52, and we'll be freaking out about, the 1 touchdown the defense allowed, or the 1 turnover on the offense, or the 1 sack that was allowed. You name it. August, it's like everything's great. Nothing can derail this train. And then you start playing in games and you hit some adversity, and then it's every little thing becomes a train wreck. So we always try to kind of, bring it back to the middle here, keep things in perspective. But I do feel a lot of genuine optimism around this team right now, that I think, they know, this roster is a little different than, Ohio State always has a loaded roster, but this roster is different. Like, this roster really has the pieces for this team to have the chance to have a really special season. They got to go do it, and it's still over 3 months really before they really get put to the test of whether they can go accomplish those marquee goals of beating Michigan, winning the Big Ten championship game, and winning the national championship game. But it's a positive sign that we're coming out of 1 week of camp, and we're not talking about, this major issue, how are they going to solve it? We're talking about a lot of really good things that we've seen that give us reason to be optimistic about the season ahead.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Will Howard, for me, has been the single biggest kind of thing that has shifted my mindset. I had a lot of questions about him in the spring and the summer, and to his credit, to the coaching staff's credit, I have looked like a fool who wanted results too quickly in those sessions. And now, again, never want to read too much into the first week of fall camp here, but I think Will has started to show, again, the makings of a guy who can really lead this specific roster with so much talent around him to a national title. And that has been, for me, I think, the biggest thing of like, okay, yeah, this team might be really ready, because I never had any questions about this defense entering the fall, never had any questions about the weapons. It was the O-line, it was the quarterback, the O-line, still to be determined. You like the physical changes they made. Quarterback, my confidence level has risen every day after that first practice we saw in Will Howard and what he could do this year. Deep ball, some deep ball concerns aside with him, but maybe he'll prove me wrong in that area. And it feels like you could just throw the ball anywhere in Jeremiah Smith's area code and he's going to come down with it sometimes. So that's always a benefit when you have those kinds of receiving weapons. Maybe you don't need to be the most precise with your deep ball, but yeah, to your point, Ryan Day even said it at Big Ten Media Days. Like, everyone thinks they had a great summer. Everyone likes where they are, but it's just that feeling of being, this is a special roster, a special team that could go out and do some special things. But we're going to see how it develops the next 3 weeks in fall camp. And then we're going to see it try and play out on the field. And they have this really slow ramp up to the games that actually mean something. So it's going to slowly unfold, but it's definitely, that feeling is there. Like, hey, this team feels like a national title caliber team.
Lots more preseason camp and Ohio State football season preview coverage to come on 11warriors.com. So make sure you're keeping up with all of our Ohio State football content over there. And we'll be back next week for another episode of Real Pod Wednesdays.